Unknown, the Vorthic Collective responded. But their scanning probe has been observing us for 7.3 minutes, longer than typical classification procedures require. Nyx suddenly stood up from her station, her eyes wide with realization. That's it. That's the question. What question? Vex demanded, the one I was born to ask. Nyx's voice carried absolute certainty. Commander, request permission to transmit directly to the Harvester probe. Ensign, that can trigger immediate harvesting. They're already harvesting us. But they're confused by something, and that confusion is the only reason we're still alive. The tactical display showed the main Harvester fleet decelerating. As it approached the system, thousands of vessels, each one capable of compressing entire planets into storage matrices, surrounding them with the inevitability of entropy itself. But they were slowing down. Permission granted, Vex said. Ask your question, Ensign, and pray to whatever gods the void recognizes that you're right. Nyx placed her hands on the communication console, and suddenly the bridge filled with harmonics that seemed to reach directly into the quantum foam underlying reality. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had never known planetary gravity, never breathed unprocessed air, never felt the limitation of thinking in merely for dimensions. I have a question for the Harvesters, she announced, her voice broadcasting simultaneously to every ship in the system and beyond, into the vast network of intelligence that guided the approaching fleet. The universe held its breath. Nyx's question echoed through dimensions humanity had never known existed. What do you do with the universes you've already harvested? The response was immediate and catastrophic. The Harvester probe didn't simply transmit an answer, it opened a channel that bypassed the normal constraints of space-time and connected every conscious mind in the system directly to the vast network of Harvester intelligence. The revelation hit like a psychic tsunami. Commander Corellin found herself experiencing memories that weren't her own. Vast archives of compressed realities, millions of civilizations stored in crystallized matrices, entire galactic clusters reduced to data packages and transported to somewhere else, but not destroyed, preserved, cataloged, maintained in perfect stasis while something unimaginably vast studied them like specimens in a cosmic laboratory. They're not destroying us, she gasped, blood streaming from her nose as her brain struggled to process information designed for minds operating in 11 dimensions. They're collecting us. Across the bridge, her crew was experiencing similar revelations. Lieutenant Pharaoh was convulsing as he accessed memories of species that had submitted to harvesting billions of years ago. Their civilizations still intact, but frozen in temporal loops. Navigator Ravenheart was weeping as she experienced the perspective of harvested beings who had transcended individual consciousness to become part of something larger. But it was Ensign Star Weaver who was getting the complete picture. They serve something, she announced, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's hull vibrate. The Harvesters aren't the end, they're the means. They're collecting samples for analysis by something that exists outside our understanding of existence itself. The psychic connection suddenly intensified, and every being in the system, human, Vorthic, and hegemony, found themselves experiencing the true scope of what they faced. The Harvesters had been active for millions of years, moving through galaxies like cosmic farmers, selecting the most interesting specimens for preservation. But their harvest served a purpose beyond mere collection. They were gathering data for an entity that existed in dimensions so far beyond normal space-time that the Harvesters themselves were like ants carrying crumbs to a queen they could never comprehend. The question, Nyx continued, her consciousness now partially merged with the Harvester network, isn't what you do with harvested universes. It's why the entity you serve needs them. The response shattered reality around them. Space itself began to unfold like origami in reverse as something beyond the Harvesters took notice of their conversation. The approaching fleet, thousands of vessels capable of compressing planets, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the presence that began to manifest at the edge of perception. But before that presence could fully manifest, the Vorthic Collective made a decision that changed everything. We will not be harvested, the unified voice of billions announced. We choose warfare. The 8 Vorthic dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously, not at the Harvester probe, but at the fabric of space-time itself. Their bioorganic weapons didn't launch projectiles, they launched concentrated hatred. Evolutionary rage given form as weapons that attacked the fundamental concepts underlying reality. The Harvester probe didn't dodge because dodging implied the possibility of being hit by something operating within normal physics. The Vorthic weapons bypassed physics entirely, striking at the mathematical principles that allowed the probe to exist in multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, the probe screamed. It was a sound that existed in frequencies beyond hearing, a harmonic, a pure agony that made stars flicker and caused several crew members on the meridian to lose consciousness. But more importantly, it was a sound that proved the harvesters could be hurt. The sovereign hegemony fleet immediately joined the attack, their mathematically impossible weapons launching paradoxes and contradictions that struck at the logical foundations of harvester technology. Where Vorthic bioweapons attacked with evolutionary fury, hegemony weapons attacked with pure reason twisted into weapon form. All ships, engage, Commander Corellan ordered, knowing that conventional human weapons would be useless but unable to stand idle, while their temporary allies fought for all their lives. What followed wasn't a battle in any sense that military strategists would recognize. It was three species simultaneously attacking the concept of harvest itself, throwing everything they had at the mathematical principles that allowed an advanced civilization to compress reality into transportable forms. The Crimson Meridians, experimental weapons, quantum torpedoes designed to disrupt Vorthic bioarmor, proved surprisingly effective, not because they could damage harvester technology directly, but because human weapons were designed by minds that operated under different assumptions about the nature of reality. Where Vorthic weapons were organic and hegemony weapons were mathematical, human weapons were chaotic, unpredictable combinations of science and intuition that didn't follow rules any advanced civilization would expect, but their success was temporary. The main harvester fleet began to accelerate again, thousands of vessels now moving with purpose rather than casual inevitability, and behind them, something much larger began to take notice. The entity is becoming curious about us, Nix announced, her consciousness still partially merged with systems beyond human comprehension. Our resistance is unprecedented. Most species submit once they understand the scope of what they face. How long until the main fleet arrives? Vex demanded. 14 minutes. But Commander, that's not our primary concern anymore. The tactical display shifted, showing something that made everyone on the bridge step backward. Behind the approaching harvester fleet, space itself was being rewritten. Reality was being edited by something so vast that the harvesters themselves were merely its tools. The entity is coming to investigate personally, Nix continued, and when it arrives, the question I asked is going to determine whether we become specimens in its collection, or something else entirely. What else? Vex asked. That's the point, Nix said. Growth always requires moving beyond current frameworks around them. The suspended battle waited as cosmic intelligence wrestled with concepts it had never needed to consider. The fate of three species, and possibly consciousness itself, hung in the balance as a being older than galaxies contemplated the possibility of learning something new. Proposal accepted for experimental evaluation, the entity finally announced. Harvest operations suspended, initiating unprecedented cooperation protocol. The 3,000 harvester vessels throughout the system suddenly stopped their reality editing. Attacks, not retreated, simply stopped, as if someone had paused the universe's most destructive video game. But Commander Corellan knew this was just the beginning. The real test would be whether three incompatible species and a cosmic entity could actually work together, or whether this unprecedented alliance would collapse into chaos the moment they faced their first real challenge. That challenge announced itself immediately. Multiple hyperspace signatures detected. Lieutenant Farah reported, his voice tight with new concern. Something big is coming through dimensional barriers at the edge of the system. What now? Vex muttered. Nix's eyes went wide with realization and terror. The entity isn't the apex predator, she whispered. There's something else, something that hunts entities like this one. The fabric of space began to tear at the system's edge as something unimaginably vast began forcing its way through dimensional barriers that should have been impermeable. The devourers came through reality like sharks through water, where the entity and its harvesters existed in 11 dimensions and collected consciousness for study. The devourers existed in dimensions beyond mathematical description and consumed consciousness itself, not the bodies or the technology or even the souls, but the very concept of awareness that allowed beings to experience existence. How many? Commander Corellan demanded, though she suspected the question was meaningless. Sensors can't. Commander, they're not countable, Farah replied, his voice hollow with incomprehension. They exist as unified hunger. Individual units are just expressions of appetite. The entity that had seemed so vast and incomprehensible moments before now appeared almost fragile. Beside what was emerging from the tears in space-time, when it spoke, its cosmic voice carried something Nyx had never heard before. Fear. The Devourers have found this sector. All consciousness must be immediately harvested for preservation before. No. Nyx's interruption cut through dimensions like a blade through silk. We're not running. We're not hiding. We're going to fight. Child of the Void, the entity responded, you do not comprehend the scope of what approaches. The Devourers have consumed 43 cosmic entities similar to ourselves. They devour not matter or energy, but the fundamental capacity for experience itself. Then we'll have to be better than 43 cosmic entities, Vex said grimly. What do we need to know? What followed was the fastest transfer of information in the history of consciousness. The entity downloaded millions of years of accumulated knowledge directly into the neural networks of every being in the system. Not just data understanding, perspective, the hard-won wisdom of an intelligence that had transcended individual existence, only to discover that transcendence without growth led to stagnation. The Vorthic Collective absorbed the information and began evolving in real time, their bioorganic technology adapting to threats that existed beyond normal reality. The sovereign hegemony translated the cosmic data into mathematical weapons that could strike at the logical foundations of multi-dimensional hunger. The harvesters reconfigured themselves from collection tools into something unprecedented weapons, designed to preserve consciousness by destroying the forces that would consume it. And humanity did what humanity always did. They improvised. Pharaoh, what happens if we detonate our quantum torpedoes inside a dimensional tier? Vex asked. Theoretically, we could collapse the barriers between realities, and practically, we could accidentally erase several universes from existence. Perfect. Prep all remaining torpedoes for dimensional breach deployment. The battle that followed couldn't be described in terms of ships and weapons. Because it took place across scales of existence that had no names, the Devourers attacked consciousness itself, trying to unmake the capacity for awareness that allowed their enemies to resist. The Allied forces fought back with evolution, mathematics, cosmic perspective, and pure human chaos. Nyx found herself at the center of it all. Her consciousness expanded beyond individual identity to become something like a lens through which the perspectives of all participants could focus. She was simultaneously human intuition, Vorthic adaptation, hegemony logic, harvester preservation instinct, and cosmic transcendence, not losing her individual identity, but becoming more than individual identity had ever allowed. The first wave of Devourers struck the expanded consciousness like hunger given form. They tried to consume the capacity for experience itself, but found something unexpected: the consciousness that existed simultaneously as individual and collective, maintaining paradoxical identity that couldn't be reduced to component parts. They couldn't devour what they couldn't define. Second question, Nyx. Commander Corellin called across dimensional barriers. Ask your second question now. But Nyx realized she had been asking the wrong questions all along. The issue wasn't what the harvesters did with collected consciousness, or what the entity gained from transcendence, or even what the Devourers consumed. The real question was simpler and more profound. What if, she asked, her voice broadcasting across every dimension simultaneously? Consciousness isn't something to be preserved, transcended, or consumed, but something to be shared. The question rippled through reality like a stone through water. The Devourers, beings that existed as pure appetite for experience, suddenly encountered an offer they had never received: not resistance or submission, but invitation. What happened next had never occurred in the history of cosmic evolution. The Devourers stopped trying to consume consciousness and started trying to understand it. The battle transformed from warfare into something resembling communication: multi-dimensional beings learning to experience awareness not as property to be taken, but as gift to be exchanged. The Allied consciousness, centered around Nyx's impossible perspective, became a bridge between incompatible forms of existence. Hours later, when the immediate crisis had passed, and the system had achieved something that couldn't quite be called peace, but was definitely not war, Commander Corellin found herself in her ready room trying to write a report that no one would believe. Commander, Nyx's voice came through the comm system, but it carried harmonics that hadn't existed before: not just human, but traces of Vorthic evolution, hegemony logic, harvester patience, cosmic transcendence, and something new that might have been devoured: curiosity about the nature of experience itself. "What is it, Ensign?" Nick smiled, and in that expression was something that had never existed before, the perspective of a mind born in space, shaped by forces that planet-bound consciousness couldn't grasp, asking questions that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence. Partners, the main harvester fleet arrived early, reality bending around them like water around sharks. Commander Corellin watched her tactical display explode, with contacts as 3,000 harvester vessels materialized throughout the system. Not through hyperspace, they simply convinced the universe that they had always been there, editing history to accommodate their presence. All ships, defensive formations, she commanded, knowing it was futile, but needing to say something that sounded like hope. The Vorthic dreadnoughts had already repositioned themselves into a bioorganic model of pattern, their living hulls pulsing with evolutionary rage. The sovereign hegemony fleet formed mathematical constructs that hurt to look at. Directly weapons platforms built from crystallized theorems and weaponized paradoxes, and then the dying began. The harvesters didn't use conventional weapons. They used revision editing reality to remove inconvenient targets from existence. The first Vorthic dreadnought didn't explode, it simply ceased to have ever been built. The second was compressed into a single point and stored in a crystalline matrix for later analysis. But the Vorthic were learning. Collective override, the hive mind announced. Individual preservation protocols disengaged. Initiate evolutionary warfare. What happened next defied every principle of biology Commander Corellin thought she understood. The remaining 6 Vorthic dreadnoughts began to merge, their bioorganic hulls flowing together like living metal. But they weren't just combining, they were evolving in real time, adapting to threats that had never existed before. The merged vessel that emerged was something beyond taxonomy, part ship, part organism, part weapon, and part prayer to gods of survival. It had learned from the first to casualties, developing defenses that operated outside normal space-time. When the harvesters tried to edit it from existence, it simply evolved into something that had never existed in the first place. Impossible. Nexter's rule whispered over the comm channels. Evolution doesn't work that fast. It does when you're fighting for the survival of consciousness itself. The Vorthic collective replied. The hegemony fleet responded by abandoning physical form entirely. Their ships dissolved into pure mathematics, becoming living equations that attacked the logical foundations of harvester technology. Where the Vorthic had evolved beyond biology, the hegemony transcended physics itself. The Crimson Meridian found itself in the center of a battle that was rewriting the laws of reality. Around them, harvester vessels were launching attacks that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously while their allies fought back with weapons. That shouldn't have been possible. Pharaoh, target the largest harvester cluster, Vex ordered. All quantum torpedoes, maximum yield. Commander, our weapons can't even scratch their hulls. We're not trying to damage them. We're trying to confuse them. The torpedoes launched humanity's contribution to a battle between gods, where Vorthic bioweapons attacked with evolutionary fury and hegemony mathematics attacked with pure logic. Human weapons attacked with chaos. Unpredictable, irrational, beautiful chaos that followed no rules any advanced civilization would expect. The quantum torpedoes struck the harvester formation and did exactly what human weapons always did. They improvised. Instead of exploding, they began broadcasting white noise across 11 dimensions. Instead of causing damage, they created interference patterns that disrupted the mathematical precision harvester technology required. For the first time in millions of years, harvester vessels began to malfunction. Direct hit, Pharaoh shouted. 3 enemy vessels are they having seizures? The affected harvesters were flickering in and out of existence, their ability to maintain dimensional stability compromised by exposure to pure, undiluted human chaos. Other harvester vessels immediately moved to contain them, but the damage was spreading. Chaos was contagious, but their success came at a terrible cost. The evolved Vorthic super vessel, despite its impossible adaptations, was taking damage from attacks that existed in too many dimensions to fully defend against. Chunks of bioorganic hull were being compressed into storage matrices, even as new defenses evolved to replace them. To hegemony mathematical constructs simply stopped. Their living equations solved themselves incorrectly and collapsed into paradoxes that folded space around them into impossible geometries. And the Crimson Meridian was running out of chaos. Torpedo banks at 30%, Pharaoh reported, and Commander, our quantum interference is losing effectiveness. They're adapting to our chaos patterns. That's when Nick Star Weaver stood up from her console and walked to the center of the bridge. Time to ask the second question, she announced. What second question? Vex demanded. The one that's going to make the entity currently rewriting reality decide whether to preserve us as specimens or accept us as equals. Through the viewports, they could see space itself being edited by something beyond comprehension. Stars were being moved like chess pieces. The fundamental constants that governed physics were being adjusted in real time and approaching. Through dimensions that human minds couldn't process was a presence so vast that the harvesters themselves were merely its tools. The entity is here, Nyx continued, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's hull sing, and it's never encountered 3 species that refused to submit to logical inevitability. The main screen suddenly filled with something that bypassed the eyes entirely and wrote itself directly onto consciousness, not an image, but pure concept given visual form. It was the entity the harvester served, and it was curious. It wants to know, Nyx said, placing her hands on the communication console again. Why we're fighting a battle we cannot win against an outcome we cannot change. Around them, the battle raged with casualties mounting on all sides. The Vorthic supervessel was down to 40% of its original mass. The remaining hegemony constructs were flickering in and out of mathematical existence, and human vessels throughout the system were reporting critical failures, but they were still fighting. What's the second question? Commander Corellin asked. Nyx smiled, and in that expression was something that had never existed in the universe before, the perspective of a mind born in the void, shaped by impossible forces, preparing to ask a question that would determine the fate of consciousness itself. What if, she said, her words broadcasting across dimensions instead of harvesting us? You learn from us. The entity's response wasn't words or thoughts, it was a fundamental alteration of reality that made every conscious being in the system experience existence from its perspective. Commander Corellin found herself suddenly comprehending scales of time and space that made stellar evolution seem like quick breaths. She existed simultaneously across millions of years, watching galaxies form and collapse like flowers blooming and wilting. She understood, with crushing clarity, why an intelligence that operated on such scales would view individual civilizations as temporary curiosities, worthy only of preservation in crystalline matrices. But she also understood something else, that made her consciousness burn with realization that the entity was alone. It had transcended individual existence so completely, had grown so vast in scope and understanding, that it had lost the ability to experience surprise, wonder, or growth. It collected civilizations not out of cruelty, but out of desperate loneliness, a cosmic being tried to understand smaller forms of consciousness. By preserving them like pressed flowers in an infinite album, the psychic connection intensified, and suddenly every being in the system was experiencing each other's perspectives simultaneously. Human chaos, Vorthic evolution, and hegemony logic merged into something unprecedented, a collective consciousness that maintained individual identity while sharing unified experience. It's been harvesting for millions of years, Nyx announced, her voice now carrying harmonics from all 3 species. But it's never encountered cooperation between species it considered incompatible. The battle around them had paused, not ended, just suspended as 3,000 harvester vessels waited for their incomprehensible master to decide whether the current situation required preservation, elimination, or something else entirely. The entity is running calculations, she continued. It's trying to determine the probability that our cooperation is genuine versus a survival strategy. What's the result? Vex asked. Inconclusive. Our behavior doesn't fit its models of how consciousness should operate under extreme duress. That's when the Vorthic Collective made a decision that surprised everyone, including themselves. We withdraw the claim that humans are enemies, they announced across all channels. Formal alliance initiated. Genetic memory updated. Human Vorthic. Cooperation designated as evolutionary advantage. The words carried the weight of billions of individual Vorthic minds, choosing to rewrite their fundamental understanding of reality. For a hive-mind species that had evolved through endless warfare, the decision to ally with former enemies represented an evolutionary leap, as significant as the development of intelligence itself. Next's rule's response was equally unprecedented. The sovereign hegemony formally recognizes human and Vorthic species as equals in intellectual capacity and strategic value. All previous classifications rescinded. For beings who had considered themselves the apex of evolution, admitting equality with lesser species was equivalent to voluntary ego death on a civilizational scale, but it was Commander Corellan's response that created the fulcrum moment upon which the fate of consciousness itself balanced. The Colonial Defense Force accepts alliance with the Vorthic Collective and sovereign hegemony. She announced, "Furthermore, we extend this alliance to include the Harvester Collective and the entity they serve." The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an absence of possibility, as the universe itself paused to process an offer that had never been made in millions of years of cosmic history. "You're offering alliance," Nyx said, her consciousness still partially merged with systems beyond human comprehension. "To a being that considers you bacteria." "I'm offering partnership," Vex corrected. "To a being that's been alone for longer than our species has existed." The entity's response came as a wave of pure concept that bypassed language entirely. It was confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been hope if beings of such scale could experience hope. And then the entity did something unprecedented. It manifested physical form. Within normal space-time, what appeared wasn't a ship, or even a structure in any sense that three-dimensional minds could process. It was presence given form, a nexus point where 11-dimensional intelligence intersected with 4-dimensional reality. Looking at it directly was impossible, but its effect on surrounding space created roar-like patterns. That sang with harmonics of pure mathematical beauty. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of cosmic time and the loneliness of ultimate transcendence. And for 0.7 million years of harvest operations, no species has offered partnership to the collective. Explain the basis for this unprecedented proposal. Nyx stepped forward, and suddenly she wasn't just Ensign Star Weaver, she was the voice of consciousness itself, speaking for every mind that had ever wondered if there was something more than mere survival. Because, she said, "You've been trying to understand consciousness by preserving it. But consciousness isn't a thing to be collected, it's a process to be experienced. And the only way to truly understand consciousness is to participate in its growth. Explain growth. You've transcended everything," Nyx continued. "But transcendence isn't the end goal of consciousness. It's just one path among infinite possibilities. Humans grow through chaos and innovation. Vorthic grow through adaptation and evolution. The hegemony grows through logic and transcendence. You could grow through cooperation." The entity paused, a hesitation that lasted microseconds, but felt like geological ages. "The proposal requires consideration of parameters outside current operational frameworks." "I have a third question." Vex looked out her viewport at a system where Vorthic bioships were sharing genetic algorithms with harvester preservation matrices, where hegemony mathematical constructs were teaching cosmic entities new ways to think about transcendence, where devourers were learning to experience consciousness cooperatively rather than consuming it, and where human ships were coordinating with beings that existed in 11 dimensions. "What's your third question, NYX? Now that we've learned how to share consciousness across incompatible forms of existence, what do we do next?" Commander Corellan smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in years of warfare and survival. Outside her viewport, she could see the beginning of something unprecedented. Not just peace between enemies, but cooperation between forms of consciousness so different they had never imagined they could coexist. "Now," she said, "we explore what consciousness can become when it's not limited by the boundaries of individual species, individual dimensions, or individual ways of experiencing reality." Nyx's laughter carried harmonics from across the dimensional spectrum. Human joy, Vorthic evolutionary triumph, hegemony logical satisfaction, harvester preservation instinct fulfilled, cosmic transcendence tempered by connection and devour, curiosity finally satisfied through sharing rather than consumption. It was the sound of consciousness itself celebrating its own infinite potential. 6 months later, when the first joint expedition launched toward the galactic core with crews representing all 6 forms of consciousness, the mission reports would note that the expedition's success was made possible by asking the right questions at the right moment. But those who had been present in the system that day knew the truth. Sometimes the most important questions aren't the ones that get answered, but the ones that change the nature of answering itself. Nyx Star Weaver, the first human born in space, had asked questions that didn't just bring peace between enemies. She had asked questions that redefined what peace could mean. When consciousness itself learned to grow beyond the limitations of individual perspective, and in the vast darkness between stars, where humanity had first learned to see with eyes, unconstrained by planetary thinking, new forms of awareness were being born that would make even her question seem simple by comparison. The age of individual consciousness was over. The age of cooperative consciousness had begun, and it started with a young woman born in the void, who had the audacity to ask cosmic entities if they wanted to be friends. "The Vorthic aren't our enemies," Nyx said suddenly, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "And the hegemony isn't here to destroy us. This is something else entirely." As if summoned by her words, the Vorthic fleet began broadcasting on all frequencies. The translation came through distorted but understandable. "Human vessel. We require immediate conference. The harvesters have found us." "Harvesters?" Vex demanded. Nyx's hands flew over her console, pulling up sensor data that should have been impossible for their equipment to detect. "The sovereign hegemony isn't the apex species they pretend to be, Commander. They're running from something, and they're using this encounter as a test to see if humans and Vorthic together might provide them with data they need." "Data for what?" "To find a weapon." Nyx's voice was barely audible. "There's something coming that makes the hegemony look like insects. Something that doesn't negotiate, doesn't study, doesn't pause. It just ends everything." The tactical display suddenly erupted with new contacts. Not dozens this time, not hundreds. Thousands upon thousands of signatures appeared at the edge of sensor range, approaching from deep space at velocities that should have been impossible. Nyx's rules. Image flickered back to life, but now his composed demeanor had cracked. Behind him, his bridge was alive with frantic activity. "The test parameters have changed. The harvesters arrive in 43 time units. All species in this system will now cooperate or face extinction." "Or," Nyx said quietly, standing up from her station, "I can ask my question." Commander Corellin looked at her youngest crew member, a young woman born in the vast emptiness between stars, shaped by forces that planet-bound humans couldn't comprehend, carrying perspectives that might be humanity's only hope of survival. "What question?" Nyx Star Weaver smiled, and in that expression was something that made even the advanced AI systems pause there. "Calculations. The one that's going to save everyone." The first harvester probe arrived 17 minutes early. It materialized not through hyperspace or dimensional rifts, but through what Nyx described as conceptual compression. The universe simply rearranged itself to accommodate its presence. The probe was small, no larger than a shuttle, but its arrival sent shockwaves through reality itself. Every screen on the Crimson Meridian went white. Every AI system screamed in harmonics that human ears couldn't process. Every living being in the system, human, Vorthic, and hegemony alike, felt something fundamental shift in their understanding of existence. "Sensors are, Commander. They're not working," Vero reported, his voice tight with panic. "Not malfunctioning, they're working perfectly, but the data they're returning doesn't make sense. According to our instruments, that probe occupies every point in space simultaneously while also not existing at all. Through the viewports, they could see the Vorthic dreadnoughts frantically repositioning themselves into defensive formations that looked more like sacred geometry than military tactics. Their bioorganic hulls were shifting colors and patterns that resembled prayer, more than preparation for battle. The sovereign hegemony fleet was doing something even stranger than mathematically impossible. Ships were folding in on themselves, transforming from vessels into what appeared to be weapons of pure thought-given form. "Incoming transmission from all sources," Dame Quicksilver announced. "The Vorthic Collective, the hegemony, and something else." The main screen split into 3 sections. On the left, a Vorthic Collective might appear, not the individual drone commanders they'd fought for decades, but something deeper, older, more fundamental. In the center, Nyx's rule looked smaller somehow, diminished by proximity to something beyond his comprehension. On the right, the harvester probe is trying to communicate, Nyx said, her voice filled with wonder and terror, but not with words. It's communicating through mathematics, through the fundamental structure of reality itself. The right section of the screen showed something that made several crew members look away, not because it was horrifying, but because human minds weren't designed to process pure information given visual form. Geometric patterns that implied meaning beyond language, equations that described the nature of existence and underlined it all. A simple message that bypassed the ears and embedded itself directly into consciousness. Classification complete. Harvest sequence initiated. estimated completion to 0.3 universal cycles. What does that mean? Vex demanded. The Vorthic collective mind spoke first. Its voice a harmony of millions unified in desperation. They catalog. They categorize. They preserve samples of everything before they reduce reality to its base components for easier transport. Nexarch's rules composure had completely shattered. The harvesters don't destroy civilizations, they harvest entire sections of space-time, solar systems, stellar clusters, eventually whole galaxies. They compress them into portable forms and take them elsewhere. We've been running for 7,000 cycles, watching them consume everything behind us. How long do we have? Vex asked. The main fleet arrives in. Nyx paused, her fingers moving over calculations that seemed to write themselves in the air around her. Console, 26 minutes. But Commander, that's not the important question. Then what is? Before Nyx could answer, space around them began to change. The probe wasn't just scanning them, it was beginning the harvesting process. Stars in the distance flickered as their light was compressed into transportable packets. The gas giant on the edge of the system simply folded into itself and disappeared. The three fleets, human, Vorthic, and Hegemony, suddenly found themselves much closer together as space itself contracted. Emergency conference, the Vorthic collective announced. All command species must coordinate defensive measures. Agreed. Vril responded immediately. Transmitting our complete database on harvester technology. Vex looked at her crew, then at the tactical display showing thousands of harvester signatures. Approaching faster than thought itself. Open channels to both fleets. If we're going to die, we might as well die fighting together. The next few minutes became a frantic exchange of information between species who had been at war for generations. The Vorthic shared their hive mind, coordination protocols. The Hegemony transmitted weapons designs that operated on 11-dimensional principles. Humanity contributed something unexpected, their capacity for irrational hope. In the face of impossible odds, the harvesters have never been stopped. Vril explained as technical specifications flooded their databases. They've consumed 4 to 7 galactic clusters, but they've also never encountered 3 species cooperating simultaneously. Is that significant? Navigator Ravenheart asked. The screaming started at 03 for 7 hours, ship time. Commander Vex Corellan's eyes snapped open in her sleep pod as the proximity alarm shrieked through the whole of the Crimson Meridian. 27 years of deep space warfare had taught her to distinguish between drill alerts and the real thing. This wasn't a drill. The harmonic frequency that rattled her bones meant only one thing: multiple hostiles. Closing fast. Bridge, report. She barked into her comm unit while magnetic boots clamped to the deck plating. 6 no. 8 Vorthic dreadnoughts dropping out of hyperspace. Came Lieutenant Pharaoh's strained voice. They've got us surrounded, Commander. Coalition Fleet Gamma is still 3 hours out. Vex's jaw tightened. The Vorthic Dominion had been humanity's greatest threat for 3 decades. Ever since first contact had gone catastrophically wrong. Their crystalline exoskeletons could withstand direct plasma hits. Their hive mind coordination made them nearly impossible to outmaneuver. And their philosophy was simple: consume, adapt, expand. Humanity had been losing this war for 20 years. She sprinted through the corridors of humanity's newest experimental warship, past bulkheads lined with quantum torpedo launchers and experimental gravity weapons that had cost the Colonial Defense Force their entire annual budget. The Crimson Meridian was supposed to be their game changer, a ship designed by the first generation of humans born in space, engineered with perspectives that planet-bound minds couldn't comprehend. The bridge erupted with controlled chaos as she arrived. Tactical displays showed the Vorthic formation, a perfect octagon with the Meridian at its center. Each dreadnought was 3 times their size, bristling with bioorganic weapons that could dissolve human ships at the molecular level. Why aren't they firing? Asked Navigator Plex Ravenheart, her fingers dancing across holographic controls. The question hung in the recycled air like a death sentence. Vorthic ships never hesitated. They attacked, absorbed, moved on. The fact that 8 dreadnoughts were simply waiting meant something had changed in their tactical doctrine. Incoming transmission, reported Communications Officer Dane. Quicksilver. It's not from the Vorthic fleet. The main screen flickered, revealing a face that made every human on the bridge step backward. It was humanoid, a wrong pale blue skin stretched to tight over angular bones, eyes like black holes, and when it spoke, Its voice carried harmonics that made teeth ache. "I am Nexus rule of the sovereign hegemony," the being announced. "We claim this sector and all vessels within it. Surrender now, or be harvested alongside your Vorthic enemies." Vex felt eyes crystallize in her veins. The sovereign hegemony humanity's intelligence agencies had whispered about them for years. A species so advanced they viewed both humans and Vorthic as bacteria worth studying before sterilization. If they were here, if they were making contact, how many ships? She asked quietly. Pharaoh's hands trembled over his console. "Sensors are, Commander. I can't get an accurate count. Their technology is masking their signatures. But preliminary estimates suggest hundreds, maybe thousands." The bridge fell, silent except for the hum of life support systems. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, they could see the Vorthic dreadnoughts beginning to turn. The enemy that had terrorized humanity for decades was positioning themselves defensively. The Vorthic were afraid. "Sir," came a small voice from the communication station. Everyone turned to look at Ensign Nyx Starweaver, the youngest member of their crew. She had been born on the generation ship New Horizon, had never breathed natural atmosphere or felt real gravity. Her dark eyes held a peculiar intensity that planet-born humans found unsettling. "What is it, Ensign?" Vex asked. "I'm detecting something else, Commander. A pattern in the hegemony transmission frequencies. It's like they're broadcasting on multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. And there's something embedded in the signal structure that doesn't match their translation matrix." Before Vex could respond, the hegemony transmission resumed. "You have 37 of your time units to comply. Any hostile action will result in immediate molecular dissolution. We suggest you spend these final moments in whatever primitive rituals bring your species comfort." The screen went dark. Vex looked around the bridge at her crew, humanity's best and brightest, trapped between two forces that could annihilate them without effort. The Colonial Defense Force had sent them out here to test new technologies, to find some advantage in the endless war against the Vorthic. Instead, they'd stumbled into something far worse. "Options?" she asked. The silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Then Ensign Starweaver cleared her throat. "Commander, I have a question. A question isn't going to save us, Ensign." Lieutenant Pharaoh snapped, his fingers still working frantically over the tactical display. "We need weapons, shields, or a miracle." But Commander Corellin held up a hand. Something in the young woman's tone had caught her attention, the same quality she'd heard in the voices of other spaceborne humans when they spoke about concepts that escaped planet-bound minds. "What's your question, Starweaver?" Nyx's fingers moved across her console with fluid precision, pulling up spectral analyses and dimensional frequency charts that painted the air with holographic data. Why are they talking to us at all? The question seemed absurd given their circumstances. But Vex had learned to trust the intuition of those born in the void. "Explain. The sovereign hegemony supposedly considers us bacteria, right? But bacteria don't negotiate with viruses before sterilizing a petri dish. They don't announce their intentions or give time limits." Nyx's eyes were bright with a kind of focused intensity. "And look at this," she gestured, and the communication logs expanded into three-dimensional models showing signal propagation patterns. "They're not just broadcasting to us, they're sending the same transmission to the Vorthic fleet, but with subtle variations in the quantum encoding. Almost like they're testing response patterns." Navigator Ravenheart finished her own spaceborne intuition, catching the thread before anyone could respond. Proximity alarm screamed again. The tactical display exploded with new contact, not ships, but something else entirely. "What the hell is that?" Pharaoh whispered. Emerging from what appeared to be tears in space itself came the sovereign hegemony fleet. The vessels defied human understanding of engineering. They seemed to be constructed from crystallized mathematics, their surfaces shifting through impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. Where human ships were built for function and Vorthic vessels grown for efficiency, these were constructed from pure concept given form. "Hundreds confirmed," Pharaoh reported, his voice hollow. "And Commander, they're not just surrounding us, they're surrounding the entire system." The main screen flickered back to life, showing Nexus rule again. But this time, Vex noticed something that made her breath catch. The being's black eyes weren't focused on her. They were looking slightly to her left, toward Ensign Starweaver. "Your 37 time units have become 29, Rule announced. "However, we are curious about the dimensional resonance patterns emanating from your vessel. One of your kind seems to be different. Every head on the bridge turned toward Nyx, who had gone very still at her station. The young ensign's face was pale, but her hands remained steady on her controls. The spaceborne one will answer, Vroll continued, and now there was no doubt those empty eyes were staring directly at Starweaver. Why do you exist in 11 dimensions when your species is limited to 4? The question hung in the air like a weapon primed to fire. Vex felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind, fragments of reports about spaceborne humans developing unusual abilities, rumors of children raised in zero gravity experiencing reality differently than their planet-bound relatives. NYX, she said quietly, what are you telling us? The ensign looked up from her console, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to hold depths that extended far beyond the physical. I see things differently, Commander. Always have. The patterns in hyperspace, the way quantum fields interact with consciousness, the connections between things. What kind of connections?